Good evening. Welcome. Welcome. So I'm Dorsey Harrison and the coordinator for the summer lecture series. This is the second of 5 lectures and they're held on Thursday nights. The next one is July 15th. Meadow Dibble will be talking about the diseased ship, and that is followed by, and I'm trying to remember, Lori, what is the next one? Lori, what's the lecture after Meadow? Early shipwrights along the Damariscotta, and then followed by the last one is the Molly Carson, Conservation of Artifacts at Fort St. George. So please, if you could, silence your phones. And for Zoomers, please keep yourself on mute. So this is being broadcast hybrid. So we have our in-person people, and we also have actually 90 people that signed up for Zoom to see it on Zoom. We typically get about a 50 to 60% drop off, but still we did get a lot of Zoom interest, and so we're trying to make this hybrid work. Can you hear me, or do you want me to use the mic? Okay. All right, here's the mic. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Mike Dekker. He grew up and it resides in Midcoast, Maine. He's developed a lifelong passion for the region's past. He's an avid student of early American history and material culture. He presents educational programs for historical societies, museums, historic sites, schools, and the public. Mike is the author of the book, The French and Indian Wars in Maine, which uncovers the tragic and largely forgotten story of the 6 wars which ravaged Maine between 1675 and 1760. In 2017, Mike participated in an international conference hosted by the Maine Ulster Scots Project and the Ulster Scots Agency, dedicated to the history and cultures of the Scot-Irish. The paper Mike presented at the conference, Resistance and Reprisal, the Scot-Irish of Midcoast, Maine during the French and Indian War, has been published in the book 1718 to 2018, Reflections on 300 Years of the Scots-Irish in Maine. Please welcome Mike Dekker. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me mic up here. There we go. Usually I don't have any problem projecting, but can everybody hear me in the back? All right. Well, thank you for coming tonight, and thank you for the invitation to speak here at Maine's First Ship. This is a real privilege and an honor. I hope everybody has had a chance to follow the progress of the organization's work on the Virginia. It's truly impressive. And I can't wait to see the ship in the water next June, holding you to it, Orman. But I'm here this evening to talk about the cod fishing industry here in the Gulf of Maine during the 17th century. Is most everybody here from Maine? No. Okay, good. That's a very good point. Well, even if you're not from Maine, I'm sure you're aware that the fishing industry is of vital economic importance to the state today. But let me assure you that the fisheries today pale in comparison to their importance during the 17th century. It was an absolutely amazing industry, a dynamic industry that had economic, political, and even military repercussions, not only here in North America, but across the Atlantic world as well. So, as Dorsey indicated, history has always been my passion. I work at Morris High School here in Bath. I have the honor and the privilege of working as an ed tech here, which means that essentially I am the grandparent of the educational world. I get to go into the classroom, have fun with the kids, leave, stir them up, and then I don't have any responsibility afterward. It's great. And one of the things that I tell students, and I don't think that they really understand this, is that history is always changing. We tend to think of history as being a set of facts and dates and monolithic ideas that don't change over time. However, nothing could be further from the truth. And in fact, we're living in a time where America is really beginning to re-examine and reimagine the stories that it tells about itself. I think we're really living during an historic watershed in terms of how we're seeing ourselves as a country and as Americans. And I think that ties in with this talk particularly well, because for people of my generation, and we all seem to be largely of the same generation, we've been brought up believing this story about the Pilgrims as being the origin of our country. And I'm going to call that into question a little bit today. I actually was just down at Plymouth Plantation this week and spent some time aboard the Mayflower and touring the village. So I guess it's rather apropos that I'm talking about this evening. Oh, there we go.
So use the keys.
Yes. Okay. Very good. Thank you. Okay, here we go. We're back in business. Thank you very much. All right. Thanks for bearing with us. So I don't know if anybody has ever driven down Route 27 from Edgecombe going into Booth Bay and seen this sign, "Welcome to Booth Bay." If you have, I can almost guarantee you that you've never read the writing that's in the scroll work. No, because you can't, driving 60 miles an hour. I'd be concerned if you had. Anyway, it says, Pellegrinus cibum dedimus, which means we fed the pilgrims. Aha, yeah, so the story becomes a little more complicated here about Plymouth Plantation and the origins of America. And here's why. European fishermen were already here by the time Plymouth Plantation was established. And in 1622, Plymouth Plantation was on the verge of starvation and on the verge of breaking up. And in the spring of 1622, they actually traveled from Plymouth, further down in the Gulf of Maine, to Damerscove Island, Damerscove, Monhegan, that region, where the English fishing fleet was currently operating. And the fishing fleet actually supplied the Plymouth colony with the food that they needed to get through until the harvest in the fall. And subsequently, Plymouth made regular voyages up to the Gulf of Maine to obtain supplies from these fishermen. Now, we don't know precisely how long European English fishermen had been making use of the Gulf of Maine. We do know that by the 1520s, the French are sailing to Newfoundland to fish for cod. The Basques are also sailing to Newfoundland to fish for cod during the 1500s. It doesn't seem that fishermen made it into the Gulf of Maine that early, but I think it's safe to say that by the early 1600s, English fishermen were regularly fishing the waters of the Gulf of Maine. We know that the Jamestown colony sailed to the Gulf of Maine on a yearly basis beginning in 1610. I'm of the opinion that English fishermen were here prior to that. And the reason why I say that actually relates to the Popham colony. So there's some writings from Father Pierre Biard, who was a French, I believe he was a Jesuit. He may have been a Capuchin, doesn't really matter. But he sailed with Samuel de Champlain. And in 1612, Father Baird is writing that when the Popham colony decided to head back to England, just prior to that, the Native Americans had killed 11 English fishermen in the Gulf of Maine. So either Father Baird is confabulating, he's making up the story, or he's accurately recording what the Native Americans have told him in 1612. I tend to believe the latter, that it's a fairly accurate report because Baird would not have had a vested interest in making up this story at the time. So here's an indication that the Gulf of Maine is regularly being used by English fishermen prior to 1610. Now, Damascove and Monhegan, we know that they're being used as seasonal fishing outposts by English fishermen by 1619. And in fact, they're settled year-round full-time by 1622. And when the Pilgrims come up to obtain food from these fishermen in 1622, there are more Englishmen living at Damascove and Monhegan than there are Englishmen living at Plymouth Plantation. Makes us rethink the origins of America. And I would argue that those origins, it's fish that bring Europeans to the shores of North America initially, and they're coming here seeking profit. Does anybody remember the notion of the triangular trade from high school? Okay, yeah. It's surprising, when I do living history down at Pemaquid and I ask this question, I get about 50% of people say, yep, we talked about that, and 50% of people say, I don't have any recollection of that, which is okay. But what this triangular trade model gets at is the way that the transatlantic economy works during the early modern period. Now, what's being produced here in the Gulf of Maine is dried salted cod. Has anybody ever had dried salted cod? Okay, a couple of people saying, yeah, It's actually not that bad. You have to rehydrate it, really soak it to get a lot of the excess salt out. But this is what's being produced here in the Gulf of Maine and being shipped all around the Atlantic world. Would you mind passing these around? The other thing that's being produced, and I bet a lot of people can recall this from their youth, cod liver oil. Yeah, in fact, we're still taking the same thing today, largely when we're taking fish oil capsules for our cardiovascular health. But cod liver oil, as well as this dried salted cod, is, these are the prime commodities that are being produced here by fishermen. I'm sorry, everybody's going to walk away with very stinky hands. Yeah, but this cod liver oil, it's made in different grades, and I'll talk a little bit about how it's produced in a little bit. The finest grades, like this one and like what your grandparents gave you, was used medicinally. And in early modern Europe, they had a real problem with rickets. Rickets is a disease caused by vitamin D deficiency. It causes a weakening and bowing of the bones. And cod liver oil was a miracle cure for rickets. What it is, as I think I mentioned, is a vitamin D deficiency. The people of early modern Europe didn't know exactly why cod liver oil worked to cure this, but it did, and it was that it's very rich in vitamin D. Other grades of oil were used for mechanical lubrication. That's why it was called train oil. Train at the time essentially means machinery. It's used as a base for paint. It's used for lighting. It's a terrible lighting source. It throws off a little bit of light and very thick, greasy black smoke, and it smells like fish. It's also used in dressing leather. Let's see, what else would it be used in? No, I'm sorry? I thought maybe somebody came up with a use. Anyway, you get the point that this cod liver oil, again, is being used for all kinds of purposes. Now, why is this dried salted cod so important to early modern Europe? Well, as you can see, it's very well preserved. It travels well. It's shipped. When they ship it, it's stacked in bundles, almost like shingles. And each of these bundles weighs 112 pounds. It's called a quintal. This is the standard measurement for dried salted cod. So you can see that it's easily stacked, it's easily transported, it's incredibly durable. That fish will last for years and years as long as it isn't exposed to moisture. It's an incredible source of protein. It's cheap. And during the early modern period, in Catholic Europe, where most of this fish is being sold and consumed, more than half of the calendar days out of the year are days in which people can't eat red meat. They're fasting days. So what do people eat? They eat fish. Fresh fish is not available. And so dried salted cod becomes the food of the masses. This is during a period where there are burgeoning cities. The production of other animal proteins is very expensive because it requires a lot of arable land, it requires a lot of resources. Fish fits the bill. And one of the reasons why fish is being prescribed for these fasting days is the prevailing medical theories of the time were based on the works of Galen. And Galen was an ancient Greek physician talking about the four humors. And it was believed that by eating fish on a regular basis, it primed the soul for religious contemplation. If you ate red meat, it made you lusty. But fish, being a cold, wet food, promoted the sanguine personality trait, and therefore you were more open to religious reflection and contemplation. But this is truly the food of the masses during the early modern period. And now, when we look at this notion of the triangular trade, I want you to keep in mind that no ship ever leaves port and returns with an empty hold. So this fish that's being caught here, waters of the Gulf of Maine, is being sent over to Europe, where it's being exchanged for any number of items, any manufactured items, textiles, wines, citrus fruits, salt, you name it. If it's manufactured, it's coming from Europe. It's also going to the west coast of Africa, where it's being traded for human beings, which then make their way back over to the New World, particularly the sugar islands of the West Indies and Brazil. Now, it's the finest grade fish that's going to Europe, and it's what's called, well, there are a number of grades, but the finest is called Lanthorne Cod, essentially lantern cod. And it is so beautifully white and translucent that if you hold it up to the light, you can see through it, just like you could through the horn that they're using on lanterns or lanthorns. It's beautiful, beautiful stuff. The stuff that I just passed around would not have a market in Europe. That is what's called refuse fish. And even refuse fish has a value. And refuse fish is actually sent to the Caribbean, where plantation owners are buying it up to feed the slave populations who are working the sugar fields. And in return, ships are returning with salt, rum, molasses, sugar. So you begin to see the notion of the triangular trade and how dried salted cod is at the very heart of the transatlantic economy and the triangular trade. This is an incredibly important commodity during the early modern period, and it's making its way all across the Atlantic world, and it's facilitating the transportation of goods and people as well. Hey, there we go. Okay, so now what amazes me about this dried salted cod is, well, there are a number of things that amaze me. One is that here you have fishermen plying the Gulf of Maine, and they're pulling up cod in the middle of winter. The prime fishing season here in the Gulf of Maine is from February to the beginning of May. So February, March, and April. Anybody who spent any time here in Maine during those months knows how miserable that time of year is. And if you can imagine being out in the Gulf of Maine in an open vessel, very similar to this one out here called the shallop. They were about 30 feet long, and they had a crew of 3 men, and each man had 2 of these hand lines that went off each side of the boat. And they're fishing in about 180 feet of water, and they're pulling these fish in hand over hand, and they are pulling in a lot of fish. It's got to be pretty arduous work in the middle of winter to do this. Now, to give you a sense of just how many fish are being caught, we're really fortunate in that we have extant records from a fishing station down off of Cape Elizabeth. It was called Richmond Island. And the records are absolutely amazing and absolutely complete. It's an incredible resource for us. And this is just one fishing station. Bear in mind, this is one fishing station on the coast of Maine out of we don't know how many. There were countless fishing stations up and down the coast of Maine. And in the winter of 1639, there are 18 fishermen working at Richmond Island. It seems like 18 fishermen from what I can tell. And in that 4-month period from February to May, or at least in June when the fish goes to market, those 18 fishermen sent to market 105,000 fish. We know that the average weight of a codfish in the Gulf of Maine at that time was between 15 and 17 pounds. So we're looking at roughly 1.5 million to almost 2 million pounds of live weight cod that these 18 guys are pulling out of the Gulf of Maine by hand in that 4-month period. Gives you a sense of just how many cod are being pulled out of the Gulf of Maine. And it's an incredible process to get fish from the boat to being a merchandisable product. And what I liken these fishing stations to are essentially fish processing plants. So here we have a period image of one of these fishing stations in operation. And you can see the shallop pulled up to the wharf. And the wharf is called a stage. And the stage is where most of the initial processing is going to occur. So they unload the fish, they bring it up to the stage, and built into the stage is a table. And at this table, there are 3 men. And each of the men has a specific job. Now, imagine this is, let's say it's April. You don't have a whole lot of sunlight during the day. This boat has just come in. The boat may have as many as 300 fish on board. And there are multiple boats coming into this stage at any one time. So they're probably processing in the neighborhood of 1,000 fish in an afternoon. And you got to get this done quickly before you lose the light. So these guys are moving really quickly. So at this table, you've got 3 men, and each man has a specific job, and each man has a specific tool for the job. The first man at the table is called the header, he's called the throater. And his job is to open up the fish at the gills, cut down the cod, take out the innards, reserve the liver, which would then go in a basket. This is going to make cod liver oil. The guts are thrown overboard. He passes the fish down the table to the next guy, who's the header. And the header has one of these knives. It's essentially a big meat cleaver. His job is to take the head off. He then slides the fish down the table to the next guy, who's probably the most experienced man on the table. And he's the splitter. And his job is to remove the backbone of the fish so that it can then be opened up like a book and salted. And the reason why this knife doesn't have a tip is you just cut down the backbone on one side, through the tailbone at the end, back up the other side, and that spine comes right out. And now the fish opens up, just like you saw, just like a book. The fish is then salted. It's given a fairly liberal dosing of salt, and it's piled up, and it sits in the salt for about a day. This is a rather abbreviated version of the process, but I think it gets the point across. After about a day sitting in the salt, here's another period image of one of these fishing stations. The fish is brought down to the shore, and I don't know if you can see here, but there is essentially, they call it's like a crib in the water. And what they're doing is they're washing out the excess salt. It's like a washing machine for the fish. They pile the fish in, the tide comes in, washes over it. They have these big mop-like tools on a big long handle that they agitate the fish with, and it washes out most of the excess salt. Because if you leave too much salt on the fish, it's essentially going to cook and burn the fish. You want a fairly light salting on the fish in order to adequately dry it. So after it's washed and it's drained, it's brought to what are called the flakes, which are these drying racks. And here, this is just a small representation of the flakes. These flakes or drying racks would have occupied acres and acres of ground. They're drying thousands and thousands of fish at any one time. And it sounds like a simple procedure just to lay these fish out and let them dry. But let me tell you, it's not. Because this engaged in this process. And in fact, we've seen records of lawsuits being filed fish. In one instance, they would call him the shoreman. The shoreman must have had a penchant for drink, because they're referring to the fact that he keeps a bottle in his boot, and he often spends the days underneath the drying rack sleeping. And they bring suit against this guy because they lose the season's catch. So what you have to do here, you're not just simply laying them out to dry, you have to have a constant eye on the weather, because you can't allow any moisture to get on the flesh of the fish. The skin actually acts as a protective barrier. So if there's any sign of rain or snow coming in, the fish have to be flipped skin side up. Once that threat passes, you flip them flesh side up. At night, so that you don't get any condensation on the fish, you flip them skin side up. In the morning, you flip them flesh side up. So you're handling these fish several times a day. It's a constant process of flipping thousands and thousands of fish, if you can imagine. Must have been exhausting. And actually, right up into the 20th century in Newfoundland, it's fascinating to listen to the stories of school children who remember sitting in school, having an eye on the weather, and if it looked like they were about to get some precipitation, these kids were let out of school to go and flip fish that were drying on the racks. Now, one of the things that I find interesting about the fisheries is the changes that it undergoes over time. Initially, English fishermen come over here, and they are employees of English merchants on the west coast of England. They're indentured, and they're indentured usually for a period of 3 years. And these people are paid with a combination of wages as well as shares of what is caught for the season. Most of these guys, it seems, or a lot of them, end up staying here in the New World. Most men do not want to spend their lives fishing. It's absolutely grueling work. It takes a toll on the body. And most of these men are looking to make an independent go for themselves as landholders and farmers and gain some independence that way. In the 1640s, when the English Civil War breaks out, that whole system undergoes a change because the English Civil Wars cause a breakdown in this system. And what you begin to see is the development of a North American fishery, where you've got groups of 4 men who work for themselves, and they finance their fishing operations through a local merchant out of Boston, Marblehead, or Salem. And in fact, a lot of these fishermen who are fishing up here on the coast of Maine have very close ties to those 3 communities. And some of them probably shift between those communities depending on the season. They might be out on Damascove in the winter and then return to Marblehead in the summer. But it seems to be a lot of movement back and forth between these guys. And at that point, they're working for themselves, and they'll form boats companies of 4 men, and they'll equally share the proceeds for the season as well as the expenses. And I think it's one of the interesting pieces of the story is these guys, everything is conducted on credit. And so if they have a bad season, they're screwed. They're operating on very small margins. Their profit margin is small. What they do is they contract with a merchant to obtain credit for boats, for clothing, for equipment. And in return, they promise that merchant all of their fish for the season. And then he promises to market it for them at market price, whatever that means. And that fluctuates. So these resident fishermen are highly dependent upon merchants in Boston and a system of credit. And when that system of credit breaks down for whatever reason, these men experience incredible hardship. To give you an example, from Pemaquid Damascus region when King Philip's War breaks out here in 1676. And these fishermen, all the residents in this area, are forced to flee the coast of Maine and become refugees in Salem, Marblehead, and Boston. We see two wonderful examples of what happens when this credit system breaks down. One of them is a man by the name of William Waters, who's a fisherman out on Damascus Cove. He is forced to flee with his family at the outbreak of the war. When William Waters gets to Boston, within several months, he dies. We don't know exactly why, but his estate is insolvent because of the amount of debt that he has. And because of that, his wife, Abigail, is forced to give up her children to become servants in somebody's household somewhere in Massachusetts through the order of the court. Another example is a fisherman from Pemaquid. His name is John Cole. And John Cole experiences much the same thing. He has to flee from the region at the outbreak of the war. He goes down to Marblehead. Within several months, he's dead. He leaves behind one son, John Cole Jr., who then has to be taken in by either, we're not really sure if they're family members or just assigned members of the community. So it's a very tenuous existence for these guys. And in fact, by the end, the end of the 17th century, the fisheries undergo another change where these merchants out of Boston, then they kind of cut out these independent fishermen and they begin to control the operations themselves. They buy larger vessels, they employ people to work the vessels, they go further offshore because the Gulf of Maine is just too unstable due to continued problems with the Native Americans here and continued outbreaks of war. And so these merchants begin fishing the waters of the banks, George's Bank. They're going up to Nova Scotia to fish. So longer voyages, larger ships, and employees, and you begin to see the loss of these independent fishermen. So it's kind of interesting to see the cyclical nature of the fisheries and how fishermen are either employed or function as independent fishermen. You know, during the 17th century, people thought that the cod here in the Gulf of Maine were an endless bounty. You see very early on explorers like Martin Pring, John Smith, Bartholomew Gosnold, George Weymouth talking about how you can just take a basket with a rock in it, attached to a rope, you throw it overboard and you just pull up fish. The fish are everywhere. It's fish like these Europeans have never seen before. And as I was talking earlier, you know, look at those records from Richmond Island where those 18 fishermen caught in excess of 1.5 million live pounds of fish in 4 months. Of course they thought this would never end. But guess what? All good things come to an end. And that brings us to the current state of the fisheries in the Gulf of Maine. As of today, there is no recreation, there is, but very, you know, for all intents and purposes, there is no viable recreational or commercial cod fishery in the Gulf of Maine. During the 20th century, we were seeing banner landings of cod in the Gulf of Maine. But fishermen were having to work harder and harder for them every year and applying new technologies to harvest these fish. In the 1970s, you had huge factory trawlers working in the Gulf of Maine. A lot of them were from overseas, Russian factory trawlers, and they were just scouring the ocean floor in search of cod fishing. They were catching record numbers of cod fish. The US passed a law in 1976, it was called the Magnuson Act, which forbade foreign factory trawlers from working within US territorial waters out to 200 miles. But one of the unintended consequences of that is in this vacuum that was created by the absence of these factory trawlers, American fishermen just picked up the slack. There was an addendum or a loophole within the Magnuson Act that was designed to help farmers, that encouraged people to buy equipment in large diesel engines. And so American fishermen just seized upon that opportunity and turned it around to buy brand new boats powered by big, powerful diesel engines that just dragged the ocean floor. And so by the 1990s, you were seeing record catches of cod in the Gulf of Maine. It seemed like it would never end. But 1992, the bottom dropped out. And interestingly, the bottom dropped out almost across the Atlantic. Here in the Gulf of Maine, you saw it off Newfoundland, you saw it off of Norway and Russia at about the same time. Off of Newfoundland, the government passed a 12-year moratorium on all cod fishing. No cod fishing for 12 years. Guess what? 20 years out, there's still a moratorium. In fact, they're just beginning to lift the moratorium off Newfoundland today. But for all intents and purposes, there is no commercial fishery or fishery of any sort for cod off of Newfoundland at this point. Here in the Gulf of Maine, the government responded by instituting a number of measures to bring cod stocks back. It's a host of measures, days at sea, permits. None of these methods really seem to work. Off of Norway, the Russians and the Norwegians band together to come up with a system to help the cod stocks there rebound. And their system was based on what was called total allowable catch. So they look at the health of the species within a given zone of water. They were referring to this as the biomass. This is, the cod stocks, so to speak. And they were effectively able to restore the fisheries off of Norway and Russia. And in fact, the fisheries there are healthier than they've ever been before. The United States began using that method here in the Gulf of Maine. However, it has been less than successful. The total allowable catch for the Gulf of Maine, it's like watching a yo-yo from year to year. Some years it's up, some years it's down. This year, they actually decreased the total allowable catch by 24% from last year. And now the total allowable catch for the Gulf of Maine, this doesn't include Georges Bank, but kind of the bathtub of the Gulf of Maine. The total allowable catch for the Gulf of Maine stands at 275 metric tons this year, which equates to about 600,000 pounds. 1639, 18 fishermen caught 2 to 3 times that amount by hand in a 4-month period. And so it just speaks to the fact that the cod stocks in the Gulf of Maine are in peril. There's a lot of controversy between fishermen and government scientists about the health of cod stocks, but I think that the reality of it is that we may never see a viable cod fishery in the Gulf of Maine again. I would love to invite everybody down, if you ever have an opportunity, to come to the Colonial Pemaquid State Historic Site, where we actually run a living history program about the fisheries in the Gulf of Maine. It's about a lot more than that as well, but that is one of our main focuses. So if you ever have the chance to get down to Colonial Pemaquid, we're there Friday, Saturday, and Sunday every weekend, and we'd love to talk with you further about this. I appreciate your patience with me and with technology. Thank you all for coming, and if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer those for you. Thank you. Yes, sir. Excellent question. So the question is, where did the fishermen obtain their salt? And if my partner in crime here, Paul Diuti, was with me, I would turn this over to him. He has a particular interest in this. So one of the reasons that the English are participating in this dry cure is that it uses salt rather conservatively. The French are actually using a cure called the green cure, where basically they just bury the fish in salt because they've got lots of salt, and the English don't. And salt at this point is not being mined. It's all being obtained from evaporated seawater. And you've got to be fairly close to the equator to be able to evaporate seawater effectively. They try doing some evaporation in England, both through direct sun and also heating large shallow pans of water, but it's just not cost effective and it's not a good product. So the salt is being obtained from evaporated seawater. The English are having to trade for that salt. And they're getting it from the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese. They're getting it from the Caribbean. And in the Caribbean, they're getting it from English islands as well as French islands, Dutch islands. So it's a traded commodity. I hope that answers your question. Yeah, you're welcome. Yes, ma'am. Correct. So the question is, why were people traveling to the Gulf of Maine for fish instead of remaining local, such as off Plymouth? Well, part of the reason is, Cape Cod is called Cape Cod, but there aren't particularly great cod fisheries off of Cape Cod unless you go out to George's Bank. The name Cape Cod actually comes from John Smith, who in 1614 named it Cape Cod because John Smith is trying to, he's a promoter of New England, and he's trying to encourage people to come. And, he's referring to Cape Cod because he wants everybody to think that this is a bountiful land. And in fact, the Gulf of Maine is this basin of water that's contained on the bottom by Cape Cod, and it goes out along George's Bank, Hatch's Ledge, Jeffrey's Ledge, Brown's Bank, Cape Sable. So there's a series of ledges and banks that create a barrier along the Atlantic Ocean, and then it's bounded on the north by the Bay of Fundy and Nova Scotia, and it comes down, and it's this wonderful ecosystem that is just, or was, conducive to the spawning of cod. And cod like to spawn in under very specific conditions. They like gravel bottoms, they like temperature ranges between 38 and 52 degrees roughly for spawning. And that's ideal right out here off of the Gulf, off of Damascove and Monhegan and off of Seguin. They're off of Seguin, I've seen records going way, way back referring to the Kettle's Bottom. Well, fishermen still call it the Kettle's Bottom today. It's just these areas where they know fish are spawning. And when they come here and they're fishing in the winter, it's because that's when the fish are spawning. So these are incredibly fertile fishing grounds for a host of reasons. Yeah, off Newfoundland, it's actually a summer fishery. And a lot of that has to do with the temperature differences in the water. So a lot of guys, particularly early on, would come and fish the Gulf of Maine in the winter, and then they'd sign on for a summer stint up in Newfoundland, fish the Newfoundland waters, and then the seasonal migrant laborers of the 17th century. So yeah, it is a slightly different season off Newfoundland. Yes, sir.
I'm curious if you are familiar with that National Geographic special called Colonial.
No. So the question is, or apparently there's a National Geographic.
It's so old that it's before PBS, and so you can't easily get a copy of it. But if you go on YouTube and type in the Lonely Warrior, you'll see something the second to last year, the sailing ships went off and put out dories on fish for cod. And these were Portuguese. They were coming from Portugal and they sailed to the Grand Banks. But they're amazing scenes of, heavy seas and one guy sitting there in his dory just flipping the cod onto the boat and they would then process them and salt them on the boat. But if you go on YouTube and you punch in the Lonely Warrior, you'll find it.
Well, I'm going to have to check that out. That sounds really neat. Yeah. So for those of you out in Zoom land, the Lonely Doryman, if you go to YouTube, there's an old National Geographic documentary that is worth checking out about Portuguese fishermen operating off the Grand Banks in Newfoundland, I presume. Interesting.
Hi, everyone. I have some questions from the folks on Zoom. This is a two-part question. You say that cod fishing may not come back to Maine, but also suggest the same issues exist elsewhere. What are the projections, or do you know the projections of cod fishing for the rest of the world?
That's a great question. And I don't particularly know the projections for the rest of the world. But I think that question raises a really great point of why did it rebound off of Norway and Russia, but not here in the Gulf of Maine? And I kind of skipped over this for the sake of brevity, and I'm glad you raised the question, because what we're experiencing in the Gulf of Maine is a multifaceted problem. It was brought about by overfishing, but it's being exacerbated by a number of ecological changes as well. And the waters of the Gulf of Maine are warming faster than 99% of all the other bodies of water around the world. So that's a problem. There are a number of other problems facing the fisheries in the Gulf of Maine as well. And there are so many of them that it's hard to say that this is the problem. I think it's a lot of different problems that are piling on top of one another. And so you have a multi-causational, let's call it, a tsunami of problems facing the fisheries. To name a couple of them, and I just came across this the other day, and I found it really fascinating. So, and this ties into one of the other issues. So issue number one is that we've built a lot of dams along the rivers of Maine, which have impeded the migration of anadromous fish up Maine's rivers. Herring, alewives, shad, these are all traditional prey fish for cod. And in building these dams and preventing the upstream migration of these fish, we've in effect limited the food source of cod in the Gulf of Maine. And as you may know, anadromous fish will return to the same rivers where they were spawned to spawn themselves. And it's recently come to light that cod return to the same areas to spawn that they, in fact, had been spawned upon. And a number of the areas where cod had formerly gone to spawn, they're no longer going to, for a host of reasons. Some of it is that we completely eliminated all the fish that had come from that spawning ground. One of them is that we've changed the nature of the spawning ground, either through the effects of dragging for fish, trawls, or we've done it through other mechanisms, including, this is a great example. Some of you may remember that in the late 90s and early 2000s, a lot of guys were diving for urchins to sell on the Japanese market. And again, we overharvested the urchins. And what ended up happening was, as a result, we found that the urchins had managed kelp on cod spawning grounds. Cod will, like I mentioned before, they like to spawn over gravelly bottoms. And one of the ways that those gravelly bottoms are maintained is urchins eating the kelp. As soon as those urchins were removed from the ecosystem, boom, kelp sprang up everywhere. And cod will not spawn on top of kelp. And so again, you see a man-made interaction affecting the ecosystem that has a negative impact on the cod. And there are a whole host of other reasons working against the rebound of cod stocks in the Gulf of Maine that aren't being encountered in other areas of the world. I hope that answers your question in a very roundabout way. Sure.
When they build the boat?
That is a great question. So these boats that they're fishing in during the 17th century are called shallops. And it's kind of a predecessor to the dory. Initially, very early on, they're being built in England. They're being disassembled, brought over to the colonies aboard larger ships, and then reassembled. By the, well, I'd say 1640s, about the time that you see the emergence of resident fisheries, and maybe even a little bit before, you see that they're being produced here in America. And it's interesting, these are very much a vernacular watercraft. It's not like you have plans for these. A lot of times they're built by eye. It's fascinating. It's a largely lost skill today. So it's kind of I guess a two-part answer, in that initially they're coming from England aboard larger ships and then reassembled. But then once the infrastructure is established here in the colony to build these vessels, are being built locally. In fact, looks like a possible boatworks was found where they're probably building these shallops over a Pemaquid that probably dates back to the late 1630s, 1640s. So fairly early on, they're being built locally. Yes.
Hi, another Zoom question. So you had talked a lot about the different roles people played in processing the fish and then the fishermen catching the fish. How were other local colonial residents involved in the salt cod fishery?
Oh, great question. I think that the most, and this is particularly important when you get down into Salem, Marblehead, and Boston. Up here, you're a fisherman, you're essentially pulling the fish out of the ocean, processing it, and then it's being shipped off elsewhere. You may have some people who are building boats locally, but this industry fuels much of the rest of the economy of New England. So you have these merchants down in Boston, Salem, and Marblehead who are not only are they supplying the fishermen, but they're the ones with contacts overseas to market the fish. So the merchant class is very intimately tied to the fisheries. You've got large boat owners, as I mentioned, the triangular trade. when the fish are shipped out of the colonies bound for Europe, you have these ship owners who are intimately tied to the fisheries, who are then bringing back merchantable items that are all being paid for by the cod. By the mid 1600s, you're seeing rope walks in Piscataqua, Portsmouth area. They're emerging in Boston. So you've got guys who are making rope for the industry to outfit the boats and the ships. So there are a lot of people who are indirectly dependent upon the fishery. So it's like that multiplier effect in the economy. The fishery, the product of the fisheries is the main driving economic engine, but it affects everything else, from boat building to rope production. Even I would say probably it affects the insurance markets, because these larger ships that are then carrying the fish over to Europe, they're all insured. Because there's a real threat of loss on the way over to, or in the crossing of the Atlantic. So it even affects insurance markets. And that's what really makes this the most important aspect of New England's economy throughout the colonial period. And you even see it during the time of the Revolution. So the General Court of Massachusetts, within their chambers, they actually have a carved codfish. And it's representative of just how important the cod fisheries are to the economy of Massachusetts and New England more generally. And you even see that at the end of the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, there are negotiations about continued access to the fishing grounds off Canada. You see it again, Treaty of Paris for the American Revolution, in that John Adams is refusing to sign on to the Treaty of Paris unless the Americans are guaranteed fishing rights. You see it again at the end of the War of 1812 at the Treaty of Ghent, where the Treaty of Ghent is actually held up while they're negotiating for these fishing rights. So, fishing is the #1 economic engine of New England during the colonial period. And I believe if you look at the entire value of colonial exports or economic activity throughout all 13 colonies during the period, the fisheries rank is either #2 or #3. So it really has a profound impact on a lot of people's lives. Very good. Thank you, everybody. Well, hopefully it cools off tonight. And,
Thank you, everyone, for coming. If you could, please fill out your evaluations and leave them off at the table so that we can